I thought I had finally found the man who would stand by me forever. He held my hand, whispered promises of a future together, and made me believe I was his world. If you are watching this video, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and watch it until the end. But beneath that perfect smile was a secret so cruel, it would shatter everything I thought I knew about love. Because while I was pouring my heart, my time and my money into building our life together, he was using me, draining me dry, laughing behind my back, and treating me like nothing more than a stepping stone. Would you forgive someone who took your love and turned it into a transaction? Someone who betrayed you when all you gave them was trust? I didn't forgive. I couldn't, and what happened next? When the tables finally turned, changed both of our lives forever. My name is Sarah, and I was 26 when this all happened. At that age, I believed in love like it was a fairy tale, simple, pure, and everlasting. I had worked hard since college, building a stable career in marketing, saving every extra dollar, dreaming of a future where love and success would blend. My mother used to say I had a heart too soft for this world, but I wore my kindness like a badge of honor. That's when Daniel entered my life. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, always knowing the right words to say, always making me feel seen. At first, it was little things. Surprise flowers at work, long conversations that stretched into the night, a tenderness that convinced me I had finally found the man worth giving everything to. To the world, Daniel was ambitious but struggling, an entry-level employee at a mid-sized company, working long hours, chasing opportunities that never seemed to pay off. He confessed that money was tight, that his background hadn't given him much of a foundation, and I, blinded by love, felt it was my duty to help. I paid for dinners, for trips, for the little luxuries he couldn't afford. It's temporary, I told myself. One day he'll succeed, and we'll look back at this as the beginning of our love story. But small hints of imbalance crept in. Whenever I hesitated before offering help, his smile faltered, and guilt settled heavily on my shoulders. Sometimes he'd joke, half laughing, half serious, about how much I invested in him. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was harmless. I had no idea my whole world was about to collapse. The cracks in Daniel's charm started small, so small, in fact, that I convinced myself I was imagining them. He began asking for money more directly, no longer shy about it. Just until payday, he'd say with a grin. But payday always seemed to vanish into thin air. Rent he promised to cover mysteriously bounced back to me. His car broke down twice in 1 month, each repair strangely expensive. At first, I didn't question it. Love, I thought, meant sacrifice. But the pattern was undeniable. Daniel wasn't struggling. He was relying on me to keep his life afloat while he presented himself as a man on the rise. My friends noticed before I did. One evening, as we sat at a cafe, my closest friend leaned across the table. "Sarah, do you realize you pay for everything? Does he ever take care of you?" I laughed it off, cheeks burning. "It's just a phase. He's building his career. Once he gets a promotion, it'll be different." But deep down, her words planted a seed of doubt. The next sign came on my birthday. Daniel promised me something unforgettable. I pictured a candlelit dinner, maybe even a ring. Instead, he borrowed my credit card to book a fancy restaurant, then toasted me with a speech about how we were investing in our future. Everyone applauded, but my stomach knotted. That night, as I looked at the receipt in my purse, I wondered when my generosity had become expected, rather than cherished. Soon, his charm turned sharper. When I hesitated to cover an expense, his tone shifted. "After everything I do for you," he'd say, voice heavy with disappointment. What everything? I asked myself. He wasn't paying bills. He wasn't planning for us. He was draining me, piece by piece. One afternoon, I came home early from work to find him sprawled on the couch, scrolling through luxury watches on his laptop. When he noticed me, he slammed it shut too quickly. "Just looking," he muttered, forcing a laugh. Something inside me stirred, unease mixed with the first flicker of anger. Was he dreaming of a life he hadn't earned? Or was he planning to spend more of my hard-earned money on things he didn't need? That night, I lay awake, the weight of denial pressing on my chest. I wanted to believe love excused his flaws, that patience would prove me right. But the truth whispered louder. Daniel wasn't just leaning on me. He was using me. And if I thought this was bad, I had no clue what was waiting for me next. As weeks turned into months, Daniel's dependency transformed into something darker. What began as occasional requests became constant demands. His confidence grew bolder with each withdrawal from my wallet, as though my sacrifices were no longer gifts but obligations. The first time he crossed a real line was subtle but devastating. I checked my bank account one morning and saw a withdrawal I hadn't made. At first I thought it was fraud, but when I confronted Daniel, his response was chillingly casual. "I just needed a little extra." "Don't worry, I'll pay you back." I stood there stunned. He had taken my card without asking. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was the audacity, the entitlement, And yet, he spun it with that same disarming smile. It's us against the world, Sarah. Everything I do for us. The manipulation dug deep. Part of me wanted to scream, but another part clung to the illusion of love. What if he really meant it? What if this was just the rough patch before the success he promised? But the betrayals didn't stop there. He started disappearing for hours, claiming he was networking with higher-ups at work. One night, he stumbled in late, smelling of expensive cologne I hadn't bought him. His shirt was untucked, his grin careless. When I questioned him, he brushed it off with a laugh. "You're overthinking." I was just out with colleagues. Doubt festered inside me like poison. My friends' voices echoed louder, warning me, urging me to wake up. But Daniel's charm was intoxicating, and every time I tried to pull away, he reeled me back in with sweet words and promises. Then came the cruelest blow. I overheard him on the phone one evening, his voice low but unmistakably smug. "She'll cover it. She always does." A pause, followed by laughter. "Yeah, she's easy to handle. Doesn't even question it." My chest tightened as if a blade had slipped between my ribs. He wasn't just careless with my love. He was mocking it, mocking me. I wanted to confront him right there, to demand answers. But fear kept me frozen. What if I pushed too hard and he left? What if I lost everything I had already invested in him? The line between love and manipulation had blurred beyond recognition. By then, I wasn't just losing money. I was losing myself. My self-respect, my confidence, my ability to see reality clearly. Daniel had wrapped his betrayal in the disguise of devotion, and I was drowning in it. But the storm was only beginning, because beneath his charming mask lay secrets even darker than I had imagined. And soon, the truth would hit me like a thunderstorm. The unraveling began with a single, careless slip. Daniel had left his phone on the coffee table, screen glowing with a new message. Normally, I respected privacy, but something inside me urged me to look. My hands trembled as I picked it up, and the words staring back at me made my blood run cold. "She actually gave you more? You're unbelievable. Drinks on you tonight." The contact name was unfamiliar, but the tone was clear. Daniel was bragging, laughing about how easily he squeezed money from me. My stomach churned as I scrolled, each message worse than the last. Jokes about my blind loyalty, comments about how he'd hit the jackpot. And then, the one that shattered me. "Don't worry, I'll drop her once I've got enough stacked." The air thickened around me. My fiancé, the man I trusted with my heart, the man I thought I would marry, was plotting to discard me like I was nothing more than a bank account. I dropped the phone back on the table, my breath shaky. Questions screamed inside my head. How long had this been going on? How much of our love had been real? The confrontation came later that night. My voice quivered as I asked him about the messages. For the first time, Daniel didn't even bother with the full act. His charm cracked, and what emerged was a cold, cutting indifference. "You're too sensitive," he sneered. "If it weren't for me, you'd have no one. Stop acting like you're some victim. You knew I needed help, and you gave it. That's on you." His words sliced deeper than any lie. Not only had he betrayed me, but he also dared to blame me for it. That night, as he stormed out to clear his head, I sat alone in the silence of our apartment, tears staining my cheeks. My engagement ring felt heavy, poisonous. Everything I thought we had built together was nothing but smoke and mirrors. But even as my world crumbled, a seed of determination took root. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as a man struggling to find his place in the world, but as a manipulator who thrived on my generosity and naivety. He had used me, mocked me, and planned to throw me away. But the story wasn't over, because while Daniel thought he had won, he had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of his betrayal. After discovering Daniel's messages, my life began to spiral. Every morning felt heavier than the last. I'd wake up, glance at the ring on my finger, and wonder how I could have been so blind. The man I once believed was my future had turned me into his personal safety net, his source of comfort, his wallet. And the cruelest part? He didn't even bother hiding it anymore. Within days, he grew bolder. He stopped asking before taking money, treating my bank account as though it were his own. My protests were met with ridicule. "You're my fiancé, Sarah. What's yours is mine. Isn't that what marriage is about?" But there was no marriage. There was only his greed. The emotional toll was crushing. My friends pulled away, tired of warning me only to watch me return to him. At work, my performance slipped. My once bright career overshadowed by exhaustion and anxiety. Even my mother's voice over the phone carried quiet disappointment. "Sarah, love shouldn't hurt this way," she whispered. And still I stayed, because fear had its claws in me. Fear of being alone. Fear of admitting I had been used. Fear of starting over after giving so much. Then came the breaking point. One Friday evening, Daniel invited me to his office party. I had never been there before, never seen the world he claimed he was climbing in. I dressed in my best, telling myself maybe this night would restore my faith. Instead, it destroyed what little remained. As I walked into the crowded room, I noticed the way his coworkers looked at me, not with respect, not with warmth, but with smirks and whispers. Later, I overheard two men laughing near the bar. She's the one? The sponsor? Yeah. Poor girl doesn't even know she's funding his lifestyle. The word sponsor hit me like a slap. They weren't seeing me as his partner. They saw me as his ATM. My chest tightened, and I fought the urge to run. But the final dagger came when Daniel, glass in hand, stood with his arm slung casually around another woman. She was laughing, radiant, as he introduced her to colleagues, introductions he had never bothered to make for me. And when his eyes met mine across the room, there wasn't guilt. There wasn't even surprise, only a smirk, as if daring me to confront him in public. I left without a word, my heart shattered beyond recognition. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by credit card bills, drained accounts and memories that now felt like lies. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down until I could barely breathe. For the first time, I admitted the truth out loud. He doesn't love me. He never did. Tears blurred my vision. But underneath the pain, something else stirred. Anger. Not the fleeting kind I had felt before, but a deep, simmering rage that refused to be silenced. Daniel had taken almost everything from me. My money, my trust, my dignity. But he had made one mistake. He underestimated. And though I didn't know how yet, I swore that night I would rise again. I would rebuild what he had broken. And one day, when he least expected it, the tables would turn. I thought I had hit rock bottom, but in reality, it was the foundation of something far greater. The morning after that devastating night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were swollen, my face pale, my shoulders heavy with shame. But behind the exhaustion I caught a flicker, small, almost invisible, of determination. That was the first time in months I chose myself. I began with the basic, closing joint account, canceling the cards Daniel had access to, and changing every password. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. He called me dozens of times, left angry voicemails demanding money, but I ignored them. For once, the silence I gave him was louder than his words, but reclaiming my finances wasn't enough. I had to rebuild my identity, the version of me that existed before Daniel poisoned my confidence. I threw myself into work. At first, it was excruciating. Sitting in meetings, I felt everyone could see my brokenness, but I forced myself to stay late, take on extra projects, and learn skills my colleagues overlooked. Slowly, my boss began to notice. Compliments replaced concerns. Promotions replaced doubts. Still, the nights were hard. Loneliness crept in like a shadow, whispering that I would never be enough. But I fought back, journaling my pain, turning every wound into words. Writing helped me trace patterns I hadn't seen before. The way Daniel manipulated me, the lies he wrapped in charm, the red flags I ignored. And then, the shift happened. One day, I was invited to a women in business seminar. I almost didn't go, but something told me to try. Sitting in that room, surrounded by strong, successful women, I felt alive again. Their stories of betrayal, setbacks, and triumph resonated with me. If they could rise, why couldn't I? That day planted a seed. I realized I didn't just want to recover. I wanted to thrive. I poured myself into networking, attending workshops, and studying business strategies late into the night. Every paycheck I earned, I saved. Every skill I learned, I applied. And slowly, my savings grew. My confidence returned. The world that once felt hostile now seemed filled with opportunity. Years passed, and I was no longer the woman Daniel had discarded. I had built something real, a reputation in my industry, connections that mattered, and a quiet strength that no one could steal. Then came the turning point. Through a mentor I met at one of those seminars, I was offered a chance to invest in a struggling company. It was risky. My entire savings would be on the line, but something told me this was the door I had been preparing for. I said yes. At first, the numbers terrified me. Late nights reviewing spreadsheets, early mornings pitching new strategies, endless sacrifices. But unlike with Daniel, this was my choice, my fight. And soon the company began to turn around. Revenues increased, investors returned, employees trusted, and again, for the first time in my life, I felt powerful. Not because someone handed me that power, but because I had built it myself, brick by brick, out of the rubble Daniel left behind. I had no idea then that fate was about to place me face to face with the man who betrayed me. But this time, I wouldn't be the broken woman he left behind. I would be the one holding the pen that rewrote the ending. The deal was finalized on a rainy Thursday morning. I signed the last document, shook hands with my partners, and walked out of the boardroom knowing I was no longer just an investor. I was now the owner of the company I had poured my soul into saving. It felt surreal. Years of pain, rebuilding, and relentless work had led me here. For the first time in so long, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel proud of what I had accomplished. But fate had one more twist in store. That afternoon, I received a routine HR report. My eyes scanned the list of employees, names, and positions scrolling down the page. And then, my heart stopped. Daniel. His name sat there as plain as day. Daniel, Senior Accounts Manager. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. My hands trembled as I read and reread it, convinced it had to be a cruel coincidence. But the details were unmistakable. This was him. The same Daniel who drained my savings, who abandoned me without a shred of remorse, who left me broken while he enjoyed the spoils of my trust. And now, he worked for me. I sat frozen, staring at his name, memories crashing down like waves. His smirk when he dismissed me, his lies, his manipulation, it all came flooding back. But mixed with the pain was something else. Power. The tables had turned, and I was the one holding the cards now. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the moment he would discover the truth, when he'd realize the company he depended on for his paycheck now belonged to the woman he betrayed. Would he crumble? Would he beg? The thought both terrified and thrilled me. The next day, I walked through the office building I now owned. Employees greeted me with cautious smiles, their eyes filled with curiosity about the new management. My heels echoed on the polished floors as I made my way to the executive suite. Every step felt heavier, charged with anticipation. And then, from across the hallway, I saw him. Daniel. His back was turned as he spoke with a colleague, his gestures confident, his laugh that same hollow sound I once mistook for charm. Time hadn't been kind. His suit looked worn, his shoulders slouched under invisible weight, but he was still unmistakably him. I stood there for a moment, hidden in plain sight, watching him. My chest tightened. Not with longing, but with the sharp reminder of betrayal. He had no idea I was there, no idea that his fate had just shifted forever. When our eyes finally met, it was like a silent explosion. His smile faltered, confusion flashed across his face, and then disbelief settled in. He blinked, as if trying to erase the image in front of him. But there I was, stronger, unbroken, standing taller than I ever had. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any accusation, heavier than any insult. The shock in his eyes told me everything. He understood. He knew the past had caught up with him. I turned away before he could gather himself, leaving him in the hallway with the weight of realization pressing down on his chest. For the first time, Daniel was no longer in control, and this was only the beginning, because what came next wouldn't just expose his lies, it would strip away the last mask he was hiding behind. And this time, the whole world would see him for who he really was. After that first encounter in the hallway, the office atmosphere seemed to shift overnight. Daniel avoided my gaze, yet I could feel his nervous energy lingering every time I entered the room. He must have been asking himself the same questions on repeat. What is she doing here? How much power does she really have? The truth was, he had no idea. Over the next week, I quietly observed him. HR reports landed on my desk, performance evaluations and expense accounts. The more I read, the clearer it became. Daniel hadn't changed. He was still cutting corners, still manipulating numbers, still using charm to cover incompetence. He wasn't just the man who betrayed me. He was a liability to the company I had worked so hard to rebuild. But I didn't move against him immediately. No, I waited. I wanted him to sweat. Every meeting we shared, he squirmed under the weight of my silence. His usual bravado melted into awkward fidgeting. He stumbled over figures he once presented with confidence. He was unraveling, and all I had to do was let him. Then, one evening, as the office emptied, he cornered me. "Sarah," he began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here, of all places. Congratulations, I guess. Quite the surprise." His voice cracked around the edges, though he tried to mask it. I said nothing, just watched him. My silence was a mirror, forcing him to see his own reflection. He shifted uncomfortably. "Look, about the past. We were young. Mistakes were made. But I've changed. I'm different now. Maybe we can put all that behind us." The audacity. He spoke as if years of betrayal could be erased with a shrug. As if draining my savings, abandoning me, leaving me in ruins was some childish slip-up. My hands tightened around the folder I was holding, but still, I refused to respond, because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. Over the next days, his desperation grew. He began showing up at my office with reports, volunteering for projects, and trying to prove his worth. But underneath the surface, I could see the cracks widening, the lies in his paperwork, the manipulations with clients. It was only a matter of time before the mask slipped completely, and it did. One Friday afternoon, a major client called me directly. They were furious. Funds had been mismanaged, and promises made by Daniel had collapsed. The losses weren't small. They were devastating. I finally had what I needed. The following Monday, I called for a full executive meeting. Every senior member of the company gathered in the boardroom, tension hanging in the air. Daniel sat across from me, pale, his hands clasped tightly as though he already knew what was coming. I began calmly, reviewing the company's progress since the takeover, acknowledging the hard work of the team. Faces relaxed, pride filling the room. Then I shifted. But there is one matter, I said slowly, that cannot be ignored. I laid the evidence on the table. Mismanaged accounts, false reports, client complaints. Each page was a nail in the coffin, and Daniel's face drained of color with every passing second. Murmurs rippled through the room. Eyes turned toward him, wide with shock, disgust, betrayal. The man who once controlled me with lies was now exposed in front of his peers. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady. "Care to explain?" He stammered, tried to deflect, tried to pin the blame on others. But the evidence was undeniable, and no one believed him. His charm had lost its power. His excuses had run dry. Finally, he looked at me. His eyes, once arrogant, manipulative, were now desperate. "Sarah, please," he whispered, forgetting the audience around him. "Don't do this. You don't understand. I need this job. I'll change, I swear. Just give me another chance." For a fleeting second, the memory of the girl I once was flickered in my mind. The girl who would have caved, who would have forgiven. But that girl no longer existed. I met his gaze, unflinching. No more chances. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, I slid the final document across the table, his termination letter. His hands shook as he picked it up, his eyes scanning the words that sealed his fate. Around him, colleagues avoided his gaze, their judgment heavy in the air. In that moment, the roles had reversed completely. I was no longer the woman he had used and discarded. I was the one holding the pen, the one rewriting the ending. Daniel stood slowly, his face hollow, his body trembling. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Defeated, he turned and walked out of the boardroom, the sound of the door closing echoing like the final note of a song. And just like that, the man who once stripped me of everything had lost it all. But this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice, about reclaiming my voice, about proving to myself that no betrayal could define me forever. As I looked around the boardroom, at the faces of people who now respected me not just as a boss but as a leader, I realized something profound. The woman who once cried alone in the dark was gone, and in her place stood someone unbreakable. The boardroom emptied quickly after Daniel's exit, but I stayed behind. The silence was heavy, almost sacred, wrapping around me as if the universe itself wanted me to pause and breathe in the moment. My hands still trembled, but not from fear this time, from release. I had carried the weight of his betrayal for so long, letting it define me, suffocate me. And now, in one decisive stroke, that weight was gone. But the story wasn't just about firing him. No, the real power lay in what came after, because word travels fast in business. By the next morning, every department knew the truth. Rumors spread, but they weren't about me anymore. They were about Daniel, the man who thought he could cheat, lie, and manipulate without consequence. He wasn't feared. He wasn't admired. He was pitied. And that, I realized, was the ultimate downfall. He once left me alone, humiliated and broken, believing no one would ever see through his mask. But now the world saw him clearly, not as the charming man he pretended to be, but as a fraud. The following week, I received word that the client he had deceived had blacklisted him. Other companies quietly noted his dismissal. His reputation, once polished and untouchable, was shattered. He wasn't just out of my life. He was out of the industry he had depended on. Meanwhile, I flourished. With him gone, the company thrived. Profits soared. Employees trusted leadership again, and my vision began to take root. Every small success was another reminder that my life no longer revolved around what he took from me. It revolved around what I had built for myself. But the climax of my journey wasn't Daniel's fall. It was the realization I had while standing on the top floor of that office, watching the city lights flicker like a sea of possibilities. I understood then that revenge had been my fuel, yes. It pushed me forward when I had nothing else. But it wasn't my destination. My destination was freedom, the kind that comes from knowing no one can take your worth, your dignity, or your future unless you let them. Daniel's exit was just the final page of a chapter I had already outgrown. The woman he betrayed, used, and discarded was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, sharper, untouchable, someone who had faced her deepest wounds and turned them into weapons of resilience. That was the big reveal, not just to him, not just to the company, but to myself. The greatest revenge wasn't destroying Daniel. It was proving that even after he tried to erase me, I rose higher than he could ever dream. And this time, the ending wasn't written by him. It was written by me. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. The office felt lighter without Daniel's shadow looming over it. But more importantly, I felt lighter. For so long, every decision,
Every breath was haunted by the memory of his betrayal. Now those ghosts had finally been put to rest. I began to see my own reflection differently. No longer the woman defined by loss, but the woman who had clawed her way back from the edge and rebuilt everything with her own 2 hands. Every late night of study, every lonely morning of self-doubt, every sacrifice I made, it had led me here. And for once I wasn't ashamed of the scars. They were proof of survival. Friends who had watched me suffer now looked at me with admiration. Strangers at business events introduced me as a success story. But deep inside, I knew the real victory wasn't the company, the money, or the status. The real victory was finally knowing I didn't need anyone else to validate my worth. Daniel's downfall became just a story, one that didn't define me anymore. I no longer replayed the betrayal in my mind, no longer questioned what I could have done differently, because I realized something powerful. Sometimes the people you trust most will be the very ones who cut you deepest. But the wound isn't the end. It's the beginning of a stronger version of you. Standing on that rooftop one evening, watching the skyline glow against the night, I whispered a truth I wished I had known years earlier. You don't heal by getting even. You heal by rising, so high that those who hurt you can't even touch the ground you walk on. That was my closure. So if you're listening to this and carrying a betrayal that feels unbearable, remember this. You don't have to destroy the people who wronged you. Just focus on building yourself until their power over you disappears. That's the real revenge. Living free, living stronger, living untouchable. Because at the end of the day, people like Daniel will always destroy themselves. But people like us, we rise. And that's the only ending that matters.